By 1700 that day, the whole installation would know my name. At 0500, exactly one person did, and he had his hand on the back of my collar. I want you to hold both of those pictures at once. That is the only way any of this makes sense. The second picture first, because it is the one people ask about. 1700 hours. A parade field the size of 2 football pitches, cut and rolled until it looked like felt. Folding chairs in white rows, a band tuning in the shade. The colors staged and heavy in the still air. 300 soldiers in formation, and every one of them already knew the story, because stories move faster than trucks on a post that small. I stood at the edge of it in my service uniform, waiting for the part where a garrison gets handed from one hand to another. I found him without trying. 3rd rank, 2nd squad, a military police sergeant with his chin level and his eyes forward and his jaw set like a man holding still through a dentist's drill. Sergeant Nolan Pratt, 23 years old, 4 days on the installation. He did not look at me. He had spent the whole afternoon not looking at me, which is its own kind of looking. 12 hours earlier, that same young man had grabbed me by the collar and marched me toward a gate while a staff sergeant smirked and a private froze, and the sun had not even cleared the tree line. That is the story. But a grab is not a story. What you do after the grab is the story. Let me take you back to the dark. I did not sleep that night. I want to be honest about that, because people like to imagine that a colonel the night before she takes command sleeps like a stone, secure in her own weight. I lay in temporary quarters that smelled like carpet cleaner and looked at a folded guidon on a chair. A garrison command guidon, blue and white. My name would go under it at 1700 hours, and the whole place would become mine to answer for. The water, the housing, the gate guards, the chapel, the commissary, the schools, the graves, all of it. A city with a fence around it and me responsible for whether it ran clean. My phone had a voicemail on it from the outgoing commander, Colonel Everett Lang. My old mentor, the man who had signed my first officer evaluation 20 years back and told me I was going to be a problem for the right people. I played it twice in the dark. "Get some sleep, Mora," he said. "Tomorrow the place is yours. You earned every inch of it. Try not to inspect anything before the coffee." I did not take his advice. I lay there until 0430, and then I got up, because a body that will not rest should at least be useful. I put on my OCPs in, not the service uniform hanging pressed for the ceremony. The everyday combat uniform, the one that made me look like anybody. I laced my boots in the dark. I did not put on a patrol cap with a shiny eagle catching the light. I pulled a plain one low. I left my nice things on the chair. A garrison command is not a glamorous thing. People hear the word colonel, and they picture aircraft and formations and flags snapping in a stiff wind. A garrison commander runs the town. I was about to be responsible for the water that came out of the taps in family housing, for whether the heat worked in the barracks in January, for the 4-way stop by the elementary school that a captain's spouse had been writing me about for a month before I ever set foot on the post, for the gate hours, for the commissary hours, for the funerals at the installation cemetery, the folding of flags into tight triangles and the lowering of them into the hands of widows who had not slept in a week. 11,000 soldiers. Twice that many family members, none of whom would ever salute me, most of whom would never learn my name until something broke, and then would know nothing else. It is the least thanked command in the army, and one of the hardest, because there is no enemy. There is no ridge to take. There is only the slow, grinding question of whether a place runs with dignity or without it, and whether the person in charge remembers that a soldier's family is watching how the army treats them when nobody important is looking. I had wanted it for a long time, longer than I let most people see. And now that it was a folded guidon on a chair 12 hours from my hand, it sat on my chest like a wet coat. Not fear, exactly. Weight. The weight of a thing you have wanted so long that having it finally arrive feels less like winning and more like being handed a sleeping child. You go still. You get careful. You do not want to be the one who drops it. So I could not lie in that bed another minute, and I did not want to walk the housing area in the dark and frighten a young sergeant's spouse looking out a window. I wanted the one place on the whole installation that had ever felt like mine before any of this. I wanted the flight line. I drove to the airfield. I need you to understand why, or the rest of it, lands wrong. I came up flying. I am a pilot. Before I am anything else, the Army decided to make me. I earned my wings in 2005, and I flew Blackhawks for the better part of a decade. And a flight line at dawn is the closest thing I have to a church. The smell of it. Jet fuel and cut grass and cold metal. The way the aircraft sit quiet with their blades tied down, ticking as the dew works on them. I wanted to stand in that smell one more time as a person and not as a commander, before 1,000 people started calling me sir and meaning the rank instead of me. So I parked outside the fence and I walked in through a pedestrian gate that a contractor had propped with a rock, which I noted and did not fix, because I was not on duty yet and I wanted for 20 minutes to be nobody. That was my mistake, if you want to call it one. I wanted to be nobody, and for 20 minutes I got exactly what I asked for. The ramp was gray and enormous and empty. A row of UH-60s sat tied down along the north edge, tail to the fence, noses toward the runway. Fuel truck parked at the end. One set of lights on in the operations building far across the field. I walked the line the way I have always walked a line, which is to say, I could not help myself. I checked the tie-down chains as I passed. Habit older than my rank. I put my hand flat on the skin of the first aircraft, cold and beaded, and I felt about 19 years old. I stood there for a while in the smell of it. Jet fuel and dew and cold aluminum. I am not a sentimental person. 20 years in aviation trains the sentiment out of you, because sentiment gets people killed in an aircraft, and you learn to feel things later, on the ground, in private, if at all. But standing on that ramp at 0500, I let myself feel one thing all the way through, which was gratitude, that I had made it this far, that the girl who had first stood on a flight line, certain she would have to be twice as good to count half as much, had been mostly right about that, and had done it anyway and was still standing. I walked the whole north row, 9 aircraft. I checked every tie-down out of a habit, 20 years deep, and I found 2 that were a link short of tension, and I made a note in my head to mention it to the airfield warrant. Not as a gotcha, just because that is what you do when you love a thing. You keep it right. The runway lights were still on, a long double line running off into the dark, toward nothing. Somewhere a generator hummed. It was the most peaceful I had felt in months. There was a private on the ramp. I did not see her at first. A young fuel handler, private first class by the one stripe I could barely make out, doing something slow and careful at the truck. Dana Whitfield, though I would not learn that until later. She saw me before anyone. She watched me touch the aircraft and check the chain, and she did not say anything. Because a person who walks a flight line like she owns it usually does. She told me weeks afterward that she had thought that is somebody's boss and gone back to her work. 20 years old and already better at reading a person than the man who was about to arrive. Because then boots came across the gravel behind me. Fast, sure of themselves. Ma'am, this is a secure flight line. I turned. A military police sergeant, young, squared away, hand already resting on his duty belt, the way they teach you and then spend years teaching back out of you. Sergeant Pratt, though the name tape meant nothing to me yet in that light. Behind him, hanging back near the fuel truck, a staff sergeant with a coffee and an expression I have seen 10,000 times. The expression of a man who has decided to be entertained. "Good morning, Sergeant," I said. "You're not authorized to be out here," Pratt said. "Where's your badge?" I did not have it clipped where he could see it. It was in my breast pocket. My common access card was in there too. I could have produced either in about 4 seconds. I want to be clear about that because people always ask why I did not just show him. I was going to. I started to. "It's in my pocket," I said. "Let me get it. I'll move slow." "Ma'am, I need you to step off the ramp." "I'm going to reach into my left breast pocket," I said, still calm, still slow, the way you talk to a young man whose adrenaline is running ahead of his training. "My identification is right there." He did not wait. He stepped in and got a hand on the back of my collar, up high near my neck, and he turned me and started walking me toward the gate. Not gently, enough that my chin came up and my boots had to catch the ground. Public. In front of the private at the truck. In front of the staff sergeant with the coffee, who laughed, one short bark of it, and said, "There it is!" I could have dropped him. I want you to sit with that. I am 44 years old, and I have been thrown around enough training mats and slick decks to know how to take a wrist off my collar and put a man on the ground without either of us getting hurt. Every muscle I own knew exactly how. I have a whole career of knowing how and not doing it, and the not doing is the part they never put on the award. I kept my hands loose at my sides. I let him walk me. You learn that, if you live long enough in a body that knows how to fight. The knowing is not the hard part. Any 20-year-old with 6 months of combatives thinks the knowing is the whole thing. The hard part, the part that takes decades, is the not doing. It is standing inside your own strength with your hands open, choosing the outcome instead of the reaction. I have watched young soldiers who could take a man apart in 4 seconds lose everything they had built because they could not eat one insult without answering it. And I have watched quiet people who never raised a hand walk through a whole career untouched, because they understood that the person who stays calm owns the room, and the person who explodes hands the room away. A hand on my collar was not going to make me hand the room away. Not on the last morning I would ever be nobody. There was a private 10 meters off who was watching a woman get manhandled and learning something in real time about what the army does to people it decides do not matter. There was a staff sergeant with a coffee enjoying it. And there was a young sergeant who did not yet know he was about to have the worst morning of his enlistment. I was, in a strange way, the calmest person on that ramp because I was the only one who already knew how it ended. "You're not cleared for this ramp," Pratt said, close to my ear, steering. "Move." And I moved, toward the gate, with the boy's hand on my collar and the sun not yet up. 12 hours before, he would stand in a formation and hear my name read out under a garrison guidon. That is where most people want me to speed up. They want the good part. I understand the appetite. But you cannot understand the good part until you understand what a hand on your collar costs a person like me. So I am going to make you wait the way I made myself wait. Here is what a hand on the collar cost me. It cost me 13 years. Let me tell you about a hallway in 2013. I was a major then. I had a combat tour behind me and another one, and a reputation among the people who flew with me, and no reputation at all among the people who decided things. I was up for a job. A good one, a career job, the kind that puts you on a road toward exactly the guidon that was folded on my chair that night. And I lost it. That happens. Losing a job is not a wound. What made it a wound was the hallway. Colonel Hugh Marlowe, a big man, ruddy, the kind of officer who filled a doorway and knew it. He had signed the paper that gave the job to someone else, and he found me in a hallway afterward, near the coffee machine. And he was not cruel exactly. Cruel would have been easier. He was breezy. He put a hand on the wall by my head, and he said, like he was doing me a favor, "Don't take it hard, Sanderson. You people don't command anything but a stick. Stay in the cockpit. That's where you're useful." You people, aviators, sticks. As if the 12 years I had spent bringing crews home in weather that grounded braver men had been a hobby. As if the stick were a toy and not the only reason some families still had a father. I said, "Yes, sir," because that is what you say, and I walked to my car and I sat in it in a parking garage for a while. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, not because crying would have been weakness, but because it would have been the wrong shape for what I felt. What I felt was colder than that. I felt sordid, filed. A man with the power to decide my next 10 years had looked at me and seen a stick and a set of hands and had put me in the drawer where he kept the useful tools and had felt generous about it. That is a particular kind of injury. It does not bleed, it just sits. And here's the part I am not proud of. I let it live in me. For 13 years, I carried Hugh Marlowe around like a stone in a coat pocket, and I took him out and turned him over more nights than I will admit. Every promotion I earned after that, part of me earned it at him. Every command I was handed, part of me held it up toward a man who had long since retired to a lake house and forgotten my name entirely. That is the trap of being dismissed by someone. You can spend your whole life answering a person who has stopped listening. You can win every argument you were never actually having. And it keeps you warm, the arguing, it really does, right up until you notice that the person you have become is somebody who needs an enemy in order to stand up straight. I did not know I knew all of that until 0500 on a cold ramp with a boy's hand coming off my collar and the whole machinery of revenge already turning in my favor. Sometimes you do not find out what you have learned until the exact second you get the chance to use it or set it down. I want to tell you a specific night so you know what he was dismissing. 2011. A second tour. A ridge, weather closing, a ground element with 2 casualties, and a window that everyone said was shut. The medevac birds were grounded. The weather was below minimums for everybody. And being below minimums is not cowardice. It is math. It is the line between a rescue and 2 aircraft full of dead people. I flew it anyway. I am not going to pretend that was pure. Part of it was the arrogance of a good pilot, but part of it was that I had a picture in my head of a 19-year-old on that ridge, and I could not make the picture hold still. I flew up a valley in the dark with my landing light off and the mountains where I remembered them and not where I could see them, and my crew chief called the rocks and my co-pilot called the numbers, and we got in and we got them and we got out. I have flown a lot of hours in my life, and I remember that hour, minute by minute. The way the aircraft shook in the downdraft coming off the ridge, the way the 2 casualties looked when we got them aboard, one of them 19 and gray and quiet, the other one talking and talking the way they do when the body's deciding whether to stay, the medic working in the red light, the valley walls close enough on both sides that I could have reached out and touched the war. And the thing nobody tells you about a flight like that, which is that it is not brave in the moment. In the moment, it is arithmetic and habit and a refusal to picture the alternative. The bravery, if there is any, is the decision you made on the ground before you ever lifted. When everyone with sense told you the window was shut and you decided the window was a matter of opinion. We landed both of those soldiers alive. The 19-year-old lived. I met him once, years later, at a reunion I almost did not attend. He had a family by then. He did not remember my face, and there was no reason he should have. He remembered a sound in the dark and then a hospital. That is usually all they remember, and that is exactly enough. You do not do it to be remembered. You do it so that somewhere a person you will never meet gets to keep having birthdays. Chief Warrant Officer Sam Dubois was in the other seat that night. He is a Chief Warrant Officer 5 now, the most senior aviator you will ever meet, the kind of warrant who has forgotten more about flying than most colonels ever learned. That night he was a younger man with wet hands, and when we shut down back at the base, he sat in his seat for a full minute without moving, and then he looked at me and said, "I am never doing that again, and I am glad I did it with you." That is the stick Colonel Marlowe told me was all I would ever command. So 13 years later, I stood on a ramp with a boy's hand on my collar, and Marlowe's voice came up out of the concrete like heat, and it said, very reasonably, in that same breezy tone, "See? This is what they think you are. A nobody on a flight line, somebody to be moved." And here's the thing about that voice, the dangerous thing. It was not telling me to lie down. It was telling me to get even. It was offering me the boy's whole career, gift-wrapped, and calling it justice. 13 years of wanting somebody to pay for that hallway. And here at last was somebody in a uniform in the wrong with witnesses. I had spent 13 years proving a man wrong who never thought about me again. I was not going to spend this morning proving a sergeant wrong the same way. But I did not know that yet. At that moment on the ramp, I only knew the heat. The gate was coming up. Pratt was talking, narrating his own competence, and then he did the thing that ended his version of the morning and started mine. He keyed his radio, he had a shoulder mic, and he keyed it with his free hand, still steering me with the other, and he called it in the way you were trained to, clipped and procedural and certain. "Base, 6-2. I've got one, unauthorized on the north ramp. No ID, uncooperative, escorting off now." Uncooperative. I had told him 3 times I would show him. I let that go. I have learned to let a lot of things go in the second before they turn, because the net did not answer the way he expected. There was a pause. On a radio, a pause is loud. Then a voice came back, and it was not a bored desk sergeant. It was an officer's voice, tight and fast. 6-2, base. Say again your location and describe the individual. Now. Pratt's steering slowed a half step. He did not hear it yet. North ramp by the aircraft. Female OCPs, no headgear insignia. 40s, no identification presented. Another pause. Shorter. Worse. And then a second voice cut over the first, and this one I knew, because it belonged to the command sergeant major of the garrison, a woman named Ruth Kilmer, who had been hunting the whole post for a missing incoming commander since about 04:45, when someone noticed the temporary quarters were empty and the coffee was cold. 6-2, this is the Garrison Command Sergeant Major. Do not move her another step. Take your hand off her. That is the incoming garrison commander. I felt it before I saw it. The hand on my collar changed. It did not let go all at once. It just stopped being a hand that was sure of anything. The certainty went out of it, and then the weight, and then the fingers, one at a time, like a man setting down something he has realized is hot. Pratt came around in front of me. His face. I have seen a lot of faces do a lot of things, and I will remember his for a long time, because it was not fear first. It was arithmetic. You could watch him doing the math. Incoming garrison commander. Female. 40s. OCPs. No headgear insignia because I had left the fancy cap on the chair. The woman he had by the collar. The math finished, and then the fear arrived, and under the fear, worst of all for him, the beginning of understanding what he had done. "Ma'am," he said. It came out cracked. "Ma'am, Say again, Base." Because he wanted the radio to take it back. And across the ramp, at a dead run now, came Command Sergeant Major Kilmer, 49 years old and moving like a woman half that. And behind her, a lieutenant colonel I would come to know very well, the installation provost marshal himself, Aaron Delacroix, who had heard his own newest military policeman narrate this on an open net and had left his desk mid-sentence. The word landed on the ramp and stayed there. "Commander." It changed the shape of everything. The staff sergeant with the coffee was not smiling anymore. The private at the fuel truck had stood up straight. And Sergeant Nolan Pratt stood in front of me with his hands now hanging at his sides like they belonged to someone else. And he could not believe it, and I watched him not be able to believe it, and I felt the heat in my chest turn to something I had to decide what to do with. I want to describe the ramp in that second, because it is the second everything turned on. The private at the fuel truck had gone rigid, her eyes very wide, and I could see her recalculating the whole morning, understanding that the woman she had correctly read as somebody's boss was more than that, and that she had been right to mind her own business. The staff sergeant with the coffee had set the coffee down on the fender of a vehicle. Slowly, the way you set something down when you have just realized your hands need to be empty and available. His face had gone from entertained to careful in about 2 seconds. He had laughed at a colonel being marched off a ramp, and now the ramp knew it, and he knew the ramp knew it, and a man who is happy to enjoy someone else's humiliation is never happy to have his own witnessed. And Pratt, 23 years old, 4 days on a new installation, trying so hard to be good at his job that he had done the opposite. I have been 23. I have been so hungry to prove I belonged that I got loud in exactly the moment I should have gotten quiet. The Army takes young people who are terrified of not measuring up, and it hands them a little authority before it has finished teaching them what authority is for, and then it acts surprised when they use it the way a frightened person uses anything, which is too hard and too fast. I looked at him, and I did not see a villain. I saw a kid who had reached for certainty because certainty felt like safety, and who was now standing in the exact opposite of safe, in front of the one person on earth with the most power to end him. That was the heat I had to decide what to do with. It was not clean anger, it never is. It was old and complicated, and it had Marlowe's fingerprints all over it. And I had about one breath to decide whether to spend it or set it down. Here is where the story could have gone the easy way. I want to show you the easy way, because I nearly took it, and anyone who tells you they would not have is lying or has never been grabbed. The easy way was already laid out for me like a red carpet. I did not have to do a thing. The machine was spinning up on its own. Kilmer reached us first and put herself half a step in front of me, angled at Pratt, and I could see her deciding whether to take his head off right there. Delacroix arrived a breath later, and his face was the gray of a man watching his career and his newest soldier's career collide in front of the person who now owned both. "Ma'am," Delacroix said. He was breathing hard. "Colonel Sanderson, There is no excuse. This is on me. He is 4 days on post. He is mine, and this is on me." He turned to Pratt, and his voice dropped into something flat and terrible. "Sergeant, you are relieved. Give the command sergeant major your weapon and your credentials. You are done. I will have your stripes by close of business, and you will thank me for stopping there. and the ramp waited. Everyone waited. They all turned by instinct to me. Because I was the commander now, or would be at 1700, and this was the first thing I would ever be seen to decide. And they wanted to see the hammer come down. Some of them wanted it because they were angry for me. The private did. Kilmer did. Some of them wanted it the way people want a car crash. The staff sergeant with the coffee wanted it, I think, mostly so it would not be about him. The easiest thing in the world was to nod. One nod. That is all it would have taken. Delacroix had teed it up. Kilmer would have executed it before the sun cleared the trees. A young man who put his hand on a colonel would have been gone by lunch, and every person on that ramp would have said the new commander does not play, and I would have started my command with a story that did my fighting for me. And Marlowe's voice was right there, warm and reasonable, saying, "Go on. He earned it. This is not even revenge. This is standards. You are allowed." I stood there with a whole installation about to be handed to me, and Pratt stood in front of me at a rigid, sick attention, waiting to be ended, and I felt my own pulse asking me, plainly, to enjoy this. The terrible thing about the free shot is how well it dresses. It does not show up looking like cruelty. It shows up looking like accountability. It shows up wearing the exact language I had used my whole career and believed. Standards, discipline, consequences. A soldier put his hands on a superior officer, and there are consequences, and I would only be enforcing them, and who could argue? That is the voice, and the voice is never more dangerous than when it is technically correct. Everything it was telling me to do was defensible. I could have written the memo in my sleep. I could have defended it to any board in the army. That is precisely what made it a trap. The cruelest things I have watched people do were almost never against the rules. They were the rules, wielded by someone who wanted to hurt and had found a legal way to do it. I had seen officers run whole commands on that, on the pleasure of the justified hammer. They were feared and they were obeyed, and their soldiers counted the days until they left, and the day they left there was a quiet that no change of command speech could paper over. I did not want to be a quiet that people were relieved to be rid of. I wanted, if I am honest, to be loved, and you cannot buy that with hammers. You can only rent fear with them, and the lease is always shorter than you think. And I thought about the hallway, not the way you would expect. I did not think. Now I get to be the one with the hand on the wall. I thought about how small Marlowe had made himself in that hallway without ever knowing it. How a man with all the power in that building had used it to step on someone who could not step back, and how that one breezy sentence had told me everything about him and nothing good. I had spent 13 years despising a man for using rank to make a smaller person smaller. And here I was, one nod away from doing the exact same thing and calling it justice and getting a round of applause for it. I could be right or I could be whole. Those are not the same thing. I had been right about Marlowe for 13 years, and it had kept me warm, and it had never once made me whole. I had a whole city about to be mine, and in the space of one breath, I decided what kind of person I wanted running it, and it was not the kind of person who takes the free shot. "Stand down, Colonel Delacroix," I said. He blinked. "Ma'am? Stand down on the stripes. Not yet. Not like this." I looked at Kilmer. "Sergeant Major, nobody's relieving anybody on my ramp before I have said 10 words to the soldier who is standing here. Give me a minute." "Ma'am," Kilmer said and stepped back, and I saw something move behind her eyes that I would only understand later, which was that she had just learned more about me in 3 seconds than my whole file could have told her. I turned to Pratt. I did not raise my voice. I have found that the quietest voice in a loud situation is the one everyone strains to hear, and I wanted them to strain. "Sergeant Pratt," I said, "look at me, not through me, at me." He did. It cost him something. His eyes were wet at the edges and furious at himself and about 19 kinds of sorry, and to his credit, he did not look away. "You did half of your job well this morning," I said. "There was an unknown person on a secure flight line before dawn near the aircraft, with no visible credentials. You challenged that person. Good. That is exactly what I want a military policeman on my installation to do. If you had not challenged me, I would be having a different and much worse conversation with your Provost Marshal right now." He had braced for the whip. The praise landed harder than a whip. His jaw worked. "And then," I said, "you put your hand on me. I told you 3 times that my identification was in my pocket. I told you I would move slow. And you decided it was faster to grab a person by the collar and march her in front of witnesses than to wait 4 seconds for a card. That is the half of your job you did badly. And here is the part I need you to hear, because it is the only part that matters, and it has nothing to do with my rank. I let the ramp go quiet. You did not know who I was, I said. In your head, I was nobody. A lost civilian, a woman with no badge and no power to make your day harder. And that is the exact moment that tells me who a soldier is, not how you treat a general. Anybody can be gentle with a general. How you treat the person you have decided is nobody. That is the whole measure. And this morning, when you thought I was nobody, you put your hand on my neck and you marched me like a criminal in front of a private and a staff sergeant, and you enjoyed being right for about 90 seconds. He flinched at 90 seconds because it was true and specific. I am not going to take your career this morning, Sergeant, I said. I thought about it. You should know that. For about one breath I wanted to, and I could have, and everyone here would have nodded. I am not going to. Because if I run this installation on the pleasure of ending a 23-year-old on day 4, then I am a smaller person than the one you grabbed, and I have spent too long around men like that to become one on my first morning. I heard, somewhere behind me, Delacroix let out a breath he had been holding since he left his desk. But I am not going to make it easy either, I said. Easy is its own kind of contempt. Walk with me. And I turned and walked back up the flight line, the way I had been walking it before he arrived, and after a second of not understanding, Sergeant Pratt followed me. I want to tell you about that walk, because that walk was the whole thing. I did not lecture him. I showed him. I walked the line the way I have always walked a line, and I named what I saw. And I let him see me see it. Tie-down chain, there is a link short of tension, I said, pointing without slowing. Aircraft's been sitting since yesterday. Dues on it. Nobody's touched it since the last flight. That's not your job, but it's the kind of thing a person who belongs on this ramp notices without trying. I noticed it before you noticed me. I kept walking. Fuel truck's grounding cable is coiled wrong. Foreign object there by the second bird. A safety wire someone dropped. I'd have picked it up if you'd given me 4 more seconds instead of my collar. He was quiet. He was watching my boots, and then he was watching my hands, and I could see him starting to understand that the woman he had marched toward a gate had walked onto that ramp, knowing it better than he did. The reason I'm showing you this, I said, is not to prove I am smarter than you. I am not. You are probably faster than me, and you can certainly run further. I am showing you this because belonging to a place is not about the badge in your pocket. It is about whether you have earned the ground under your boots. I earned this ground 20 years ago, one dark valley at a time, and you could not see it because it does not show. That is the whole problem with judging a person by whether they look like they belong. The people who most belong are very often the ones who stopped needing to look like it a long time ago. We reached the end of the row. The sun was starting to come up gray behind the operations building, and the runway lights were fading against it, and the whole field was turning from a place in the dark into a place in the day. You want to know the thing that would have kept you out of all of this? I said. 4 seconds, that is all. I told you my card was in my pocket and I would move slow. 4 seconds of patience and you would have read my name and had a completely different morning. You did not have 4 seconds because in that moment you were not thinking about security. You were thinking about being right and being seen to be right in front of a staff sergeant who was watching. That is the enemy, Sergeant, not me. The audience in your own head that you are always performing for. It will cost you more than any actual threat ever will. Halfway down the line, Chief Warrant Officer 5 Sam Dubois came out of the operations building, coffee in hand, saw me, and stopped dead. Then he grinned, the same grin from the parking apron in 2011, and he said it to the whole ramp, loud enough to carry, not to shame the boy, but because it was simply true, and he wanted it said out loud on the concrete. That's Guardian 6, gentlemen, Dubois said. That is your incoming garrison commander. She was landing Blackhawks in weather that scared me when half of you were in grade school. You want to know who was standing on your ramp before the sun came up? That's who. Guardian 6, the garrison commander's call sign. It would be mine officially at 1700 hours. Dubois used it 12 hours early, and nobody corrected him because everyone on that ramp had just watched me earn it in a way a ceremony never could. Pratt stopped walking. He came to attention again, but it was different now. It was not the sick brace of a man waiting to be destroyed. It was something a man does when he has decided to stand up straight and take the true weight of a thing. "Ma'am," he said, "I have no excuse. I'm not going to make one." "Good," I said. "Don't. Excuses are for people who are trying to keep something. You already lost the thing that matters, which is your own good opinion of yourself this morning. You'll have to earn that back, and it's harder to earn back than stripes. Here's what is going to happen." And I told him, in front of Delacroix and Kilmer, so it was on the record and not a private mercy that could be denied later. "You keep your rank," I said. "You get a written counseling from your Provost Marshal, and it is going to be honest, and it is going to be in your file, and you are going to carry it. You are going to stand up in front of your section this week, and you are going to tell them exactly what happened out here, in your own words, the true version, including the part where you enjoyed it. Not because I want you humiliated, because the only thing worse than a mistake is a mistake nobody learns from, and I am not going to waste a good one. And every gate shift you pull on this installation for the rest of your time here, you are going to remember that the measure of a soldier is how they treat the person they think is nobody. You are going to be the best there is at that. That is the price. It is higher than your stripes. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, and meant it. I have heard enough yes ma'ams to know the difference. "Then get back to your post," I said. "You've got a flight line to secure. There's a woman with no badge wandering around on it." Something almost broke on his face at that. Not quite a smile, the permission to keep breathing. He said, "Yes, ma'am," again, and he went, and he walked back down the line, and I watched him stop and pick up the safety wire I had pointed out and put it in his pocket without being told, and I thought, all right, that one is going to be all right. The fallout moved through the day, the way weather moves through a valley, and I did not have to push it. Delacroix walked me back toward the gate, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Ma'am, I've been a Provost Marshal for 6 years. I have never seen anybody do what you just did." "Take the free shot, you mean?" I said. "Everybody does that." "No, ma'am," he said. "Not take it. I've seen plenty of officers not take a shot because they were scared of the paperwork or because there were too many witnesses. That's not what I just watched. You wanted it and you didn't take it and you told the kid you wanted it. I don't. I've never seen that." "He's a good soldier who did a bad thing before the coffee," I said. "I've been a good soldier who did a bad thing before the coffee. The difference is nobody was filming me." Delacroix almost laughed. Then he said, "The staff sergeant, the one with the coffee who laughed, that one's mine to deal with, and I will. But I wanted you to know I saw him." "Deal with him harder than Pratt," I said, and Delacroix looked at me. "Pratt made a mistake in the heat of his own adrenaline. That is a young man's error, and it is fixable." The staff sergeant stood back with a coffee and enjoyed watching a person he thought was nobody get manhandled and did nothing, and laughed. "That is not adrenaline. That is character. The one who enjoys it from the sideline is always the one to watch. Counsel Pratt. Correct him, but watch that one." "Yes, ma'am," Delacroix said, and I could see him filing it, the first real thing he had learned about how I thought. Command Sergeant Major Kilmer fell in on my other side as we walked. She let a while go by, then she said, "Ma'am, permission to speak plainly." "Always," I said. "Especially you. Especially plainly. I need at least one person in my life who tells me the truth without a running start." "In 1 hour," Kilmer said, "every soldier on this installation is going to know 2 things about you. The first is what you can see. The tie-downs, the grounding cable, the wire. Word's already out that the new commander walked the line at 05 and knew it better than the people who work it. That'll make them nervous, and nervous is fine. Nervous is useful for about a month." "And the second thing?" "The second thing," Kilmer said, "is what you will not do to a kid who deserved worse. And that one, they'll never forget. You can drill a standard into people for a year and not move them as far as you moved this whole post in 10 minutes on a cold ramp. They'll follow the first commander because they're scared of her. They'll die for the second one. You just showed them which one they got." I did not say anything to that. I did not entirely trust my voice, and a commander learns fast which silences to keep. The private, Whitfield, told it to the fuel crew, and then the fuel crew told it, and the version that ran the installation was not the version where a sergeant grabbed a colonel. Somehow, the version that spread was the one about after. About mercy that had teeth. I have thought about that a lot since. The grab was the loud part, the dramatic part. the part that would have made the better clip. And it is not the part that traveled. What traveled was the quiet. What traveled was a woman deciding, on the worst possible first morning, not to be the thing that had once been done to her. The story that ran the installation was not the grab. It was what came after. That was the only part I had chosen. There was a cost to it. I want to be honest about the cost, because I am tired of stories where mercy is free and easy, and the merciful person floats away feeling wonderful. I had about 40 minutes to myself before I had to become the person in the pressed uniform, and I spent some of it standing alone by the aircraft, with my hand on the cold skin of it, the way I had started the morning, before any of it. And the truth is, it still stung. Choosing not to end him did not make the grab not have happened. My collar still remembered his hand. My chest still had 13 years of Marlowe in it, and mercy is not a solvent. It does not dissolve the old thing. It just declines to add to it. I stood there and I let it sting, because a sting you refuse to feel comes out sideways later, usually on someone who does not deserve it. I want to say one more true thing about the cost, because I think people who have been wronged need to hear it. Mercy is not the same as being fine. I chose not to end that young man, and it was the right choice. And I would make it again 100 times out of 100, and it did not make my neck forget his hand. Both of those are true at once. The Army and the movies the Army loves tell you that if you do the noble thing, you get to feel noble, clean, weightless, like something lifted off you. That is a lie told by people who have never actually done the noble thing. The noble thing is expensive, and the receipt does not disappear because you paid it. I stood by that aircraft, still stung, still carrying the morning, and I chose mercy anyway, not instead of the sting, but on top of it. That is what mercy actually is. It is not the absence of the wound. It is the decision not to answer the wound with another one. I looked at my own reflection in the aircraft's cabin glass. 44 years old. Gray coming in at the temples I would tuck under a cap in an hour. And I could see, if I let myself, the 22-year-old who had first walked a flight line like this, terrified and electric, sure she was going to have to be twice as good to be counted half as much, and mostly right about that. That young woman had wanted, more than she wanted almost anything, for the Marlowes of the world to have to admit she was somebody. And here was the thing I understood, standing there. I did not need Pratt to admit I was somebody. I did not need the ramp. Being right had kept me warm for 13 years, and warm is not nothing. On a cold night, warm can save your life. But it turns out I wanted something better than warm, and mercy is what better feels like from the inside. Does not feel like winning. It feels like paying for a standard out of your own pocket, in public, with your own sting, and getting nothing back but the quiet knowledge of who you are. And standing there, I finally set Hugh Marlowe down. I heard later that year that he had passed. An email from an old aviation friend, the kind that goes around when one of the old names goes. Retired to a lake house, exactly as I had pictured, and gone in his sleep at a good age, surrounded by people who loved him, because that is how it usually goes for the Marlowes. They are only breezy and small to the people beneath them, and warm and generous to everyone at their own table. I read the email, and I waited to feel something sharp, some closing of an account, some last word I could finally say now that he could not answer back. It did not come. What came instead was the strangest thing. I felt sorry for him. Not in a superior way, genuinely sorry, because I understood, in a way I had not, at 31 in that hallway, that a man who reaches for a smaller person to feel larger is a man who is starving at his own full table, and never knows why. He had all the rank in that building, and he had spent a little of it to make me feel like a tool in a drawer, and he had thought it was nothing. A breezy favor, and he had almost certainly never thought about it again. I had thought about it for 13 years. That is the cruelest joke of being dismissed by someone. The wound is enormous to you and invisible to them. You carry a boulder they do not remember throwing. On that ramp, 6 weeks before I ever got that email, I put the boulder down. I did not need him dead to do it, and I did not need him sorry. I just needed to stop being the woman who ran on the fuel of his one bad sentence. I had a whole installation to run. I could not run it and carry him too. So I set him by the aircraft in the gray light, and I walked away from him, and it was the lightest I had felt in 13 years. Colonel Everett Lang found me there. He came across the ramp in his own service uniform, ready for the ceremony where he would hand me the guidon, and he stood next to me and looked at the aircraft for a while and did not say anything, which is a mentor's finest skill. Then he said, "I heard you had an eventful morning." "You could say that." "A sergeant put his hands on the incoming garrison commander 4 days into his enlistment on this post," Lang said, "and she let him keep his stripes." He shook his head slowly. "Mora, you have had the worst first morning of any commander I have ever heard of." "I know." "You also," he said, "had the best one. I have been commanding things for 30 years, and I have never once, not once, gotten to show a whole installation exactly who I was in the first hour, before I even took the flag. They usually take 2 years to figure out what you're made of. You told them before breakfast." He put a hand on my shoulder, the same shoulder, and this time it did not sting. "I'm going to miss this place. I'm not going to worry about it." I breathed out, and the sting finally let go of me. "Not gone. Set down. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole art of it." At 1700 hours, I stood on the parade field, and Colonel Everett Lang passed me the guidon, blue and white, my name under it now, and I became Guardian 6 for real. The thing Sam Dubois had called me 12 hours early on a cold ramp because he had watched me be it before I held the flag. 300 soldiers in formation. And in the third rank, second squad, Sergeant Nolan Pratt, chin level, eyes forward, changed. He would carry a counseling in his file for the rest of his career. He would also, I found out later, become the single best gate sergeant on the installation, the one the young soldiers requested, the one who could tell in a glance the difference between a threat and a lost family looking for the hospital, the one who treated a confused old widow at the visitor center with more patience than some of my officers managed. He built the rest of his service on the worst 10 minutes of it. I have seen that happen more than once. It is the closest thing to redemption the Army offers, and it is available to anyone willing to pay the price I named on the ramp. He came to see me about 6 weeks later, made an appointment through my sergeant major, which took some spine, and stood in front of my desk at the position of attention until I told him to stand at ease, which he did badly because he was too nervous to remember how his own body worked. He said he wanted to report that he had stood up in front of his section and told the true version, the whole thing, including the part where he had enjoyed being right for 90 seconds. He said it had been the hardest thing he had done in the Army, and that 2 of the younger soldiers in his section had come to him afterward, privately, and told him about times they had been the person nobody thought mattered before they enlisted in the towns they came from. He said he had not expected that. He said he had spent his whole life on the other side of it and had never once thought about the people he stepped past. "That's the counseling working, Sergeant," I told him. "Not the paper in your file. That. What just happened in your section. Keep going." He kept going. That is the part of the story I am proudest of, and it is the part that has my name nowhere on it. I found Private First Class Dana Whitfield after the ceremony, the young fuel handler who had seen me first and said nothing and gone back to her work. I sought her out on purpose. I told her I had watched her read the situation before anyone with rank did, and that the Army needed people who could see. And I asked what she wanted to do with her time in it. She was so startled a commander knew her name that she could barely answer. I asked her what she had thought that morning when she saw a woman in plain OCPs walking the line before dawn. She said, "And I have never forgotten it. I thought, that's somebody's boss, so I minded my own business." 20 years old, and she had read the whole thing correctly in one glance, with no rank and no radio, while a trained sergeant had gotten it exactly backward. The Army spends millions teaching people to see. Some people just show up able to. She was one of them. I made sure she had a first rung to climb, and I watched her over the next 2 years climb it. The young woman who watched me get grabbed on a flight line learned, from the watching, what I had spent 20 years learning the hard way, and she learned it at 20, and that is the only kind of legacy I have ever cared about. When I gave my first remarks to the installation as its commander, I kept them short, because long speeches are how commanders convince themselves they have said something. I said one thing that mattered, and I said it looking at the whole formation, and I meant it for every one of them, and for myself most of all. "How you treat the person you think has no power over you," I said. "That is how I am going to measure every one of us, starting with me." I got a test on that this morning, before some of you were awake. Ask around about how it went, and then hold me to it, because I am going to hold you to it. I took the guidon at 1700. But I had already told them everything they needed to know at 0500 with a young man's hand on my collar and a whole ramp watching to see who I would decide to be. So let me talk to you now, directly, the way I only do at the end. If you have ever been the person hauled toward a gate by someone who was certain you were nobody, hear me carefully. Their certainty was never a verdict on you. It was a confession about them. The man who is sure you are nothing is telling you exactly how he treats anyone he can afford to. What you are is not decided by the person with a hand on your collar. It never was. It is decided by what you do in the 90 seconds after the hand comes off. When you find out you had the power all along and you have to choose what kind of person holds it. Your worth was never up for a vote. And the people who thought they were voting on it were only ever telling on themselves. And if you are ever the one with your hand on the collar, and most of us are, more often than we admit, in smaller ways, with people who cannot make our day harder, a clerk, a stranger, a young soldier, someone you have quietly decided is nobody. Remember that the measure is not who you stop. Stopping the unknown is half the job, and it is the easy half. The measure is how you treat them in the seconds before you know who they are. Because you almost never know who they are. And the person you decided was nobody is, always, without exception, somebody. Sometimes she is even the one about to sign your evaluation. I have commanded a great many things since that morning. None of them ever mattered as much as the 10 minutes on that ramp when I found out I could take the free shot and did not. That is the whole of it. That is what a hand on the collar taught me, 13 years too late and right on time. Be the one who waits the 4 seconds. Be the one who does not take the shot. The end.